Good afternoon. The title of my second lecture is The Psychological Roots of Cognitive Linguistics and Beyond. Is the sound okay? Yeah, good. Some of what I'm talking about this afternoon can be summed up with the metaphor new wine and old bottles. Maybe some of you are actually familiar with this saying in English, that sometimes we try to disguise things and pretend that something has got a greater degree of antiquity than it really has by putting new wine in an old bottle. On this occasion, my use of the metaphor or saying is not intended to indicate anything negative. In fact, the new wine in this case is cognitive linguistics, and for a new wine I think it's a pretty good one. It's just to indicate really that that in many respects cognitive linguistics draws upon old ideas, but it does significantly refashion and reshape them. Cognitive linguistics, then, is a new theoretical approach in linguistics whose key theoretical texts are barely a quarter century old. And we are talking here of course, of the classic works by the people who are regarded as the founding fathers, Lakoff, Lanaka, Talmy. However, it draws upon concepts from earlier research traditions, both in linguistics and in psychology. Now, if you are interested, let me just say something now. If you're interested in exploring some of the points that I will make in this lecture in more detail, in particular the historical dimensions of this, you will be able to find two chapters in the Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics, which was published, I think, in 2007 from Oxford University Press. This is a major work with chapters by, I guess you would say, just about all the major cognitive linguists in the world. And it has two historically oriented chapters. One by an author called Brigitte Nerlich, which looks at the history of cognitive linguistics concepts in earlier schools of linguistics, and of course, in particular, the Prague school tradition, functional linguistics, and so forth, that I was mentioning this morning. And there is another chapter by myself, which is called Psychology, Linguistics and Cognitive Science, which unpacks the ideas I shall be talking about today, or not so much the ideas, it follows the historical thread that I will be trying to trace in much more detail than I am able to do in a single lecture. So I recommend those two chapters to those of you who are interested in the history. Even if you are not in itself particularly interested in the history, I think it is important to have some idea of the provenance of the concepts that inform cognitive linguistics. So, to repeat, in the discipline of linguistics, the main relevant tradition is functional linguistics, which we talked a little bit about this morning. But unsurprisingly, many of the most important concepts used by cognitive linguists derive from the discipline of psychology. Here are some key psychological concepts used in cognitive linguistics. Gestalt, schema, frame, figure-ground organization. Now, it is often claimed that before Chomsky there was only behaviorism in psychology. The idea is that you just had this kind of rather mindless behaviorist psychology, and for that matter, behaviorist Bloomfieldian linguistics, and then lo, along came Chomsky and made the mind once again a legitimate object of study. There is some truth in this, inasmuch as American psychology in the period up until the late 1950s, or really even into the 1960s, was completely dominated by behaviorist ideas. Indeed, I would say that even when I was studying psychology, which was at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, that's how old I am, behaviorism still was regarded by many psychologists as being the dominant paradigm, and very boring it was too. But this is a somewhat parochial view of the matter, because the truth is that psychology had talked about the mind and mental concepts in the period before and at the same time as the rise of behaviorism in the United States. But the point is, it did it in Germany. And most of the concepts that have been used by cognitive linguists actually come from the German psychology of the, before the Second World War. Now you can see immediately why it might be the case that this psychological tradition became forgotten, essentially because of the Second World War and because of the rise of Nazi ideology and the Nazi Party to power. Why? In the first place, many of the psychologists whose ideas I shall talk about today were Jewish. Or if they were not Jewish, they were opponents of the Nazis, and their ideas were suppressed. And secondly, and equally unsurprisingly, the Second World War meant, first of all, the emigration of many of the most famous German psychologists before the Second World War, and then the destruction of the institutional basis during the Second World War of German psychology, meant that it never really recovered and cemented the dominance of the behaviorist tradition until that, in turn, was overthrown by the cognitive revolution, which ushered in formalist linguistics and classical cognitivism. So, although it is often claimed that before Chomsky there was only behaviorism, it's not true. The above concepts are from pre-World War II cognitive psychology. And it was a cognitive psychology which was amazingly interdisciplinary. Let me give you two examples. This morning I referred very briefly to the man who is often considered to be the founder of modern psychology, the German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt, way back in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. It's a little known fact among linguists that the person who invented the tree diagram notation for the description of the constituent structure of language was Wundt, a psychologist. A second example, which will become much clearer in my lectures tomorrow, in particular my lecture tomorrow afternoon, was the great psychologist of language, Karl Bühler, who had, in the 1930s, the largest psychological laboratory in the world. He was the head of that in Vienna, and who wrote massively about language, developed the still what is the, I suppose, the major reference work for theories of deixis in language. And Bühler was also very much interested in the comparative study of human and non-human communication. Almost all of his work in linguistics and psychology of language never got translated until about 10 years ago. A lot of his work on comparative psychology of communication did get translated, and he became known for that in the United States. But he didn't speak very good English, when he died, and his wife Charlotte was Jewish, and he was an anti-Nazi. When he died, his linguistics work died with him until it was until it was finally translated many years later. Let's start with the notion of Gestalt, which everybody has. All these concepts we've all heard of, and all I'm trying to do, I suppose, is just give an indication of where they come from and what they mean, so that we can locate their use in cognitive linguistics in a way which is a little bit more explicit, because it's an unfortunate fact that many people these days don't really go into the roots of their concepts that they use and don't always reference where they come from. Not that they have to, but I think it is useful to know. Gestalt is a German word meaning whole or complete pattern. In perception, and that's where Gestalt psychology began, as a psychology of perception. Gestalt meant a focus upon the relationships between individual elements and not just the isolated elements. Gestalt psychology was predicated upon the assumption that it is the whole that gives meaning to the parts. As far as I know, I might be wrong about this, but I have looked a little bit at the historical literature. The first usage of the word Gestalt as a technical term in psychology was from a psychologist called von Ehrenfels, as long ago as 1890, who used as an example in Gestalt perception the idea of a melody. Now, with my throat as it is, I'm definitely not going to try and sing you any melodies today. But I just have to say it, and you know exactly what I mean. If you think of a melody, you can play on an instrument or sing a melody in different keys, okay? But no matter what key the melody is sung or played in, you recognize the melody as being the same melody. Even if no one single note in the two renderings is identical. Even if there is no identical element across the two renderings in different keys, still it's the same melody. So what makes us able to recognize it as a melody, as the identical melody, it's Gestalt, its whole quality, the relationship between the elements. And this is very interesting. And something which is amazing about this is that you might like to think, to what extent is this fact about human perception unique to humans? Do you think other animals have the ability to really understand this Gestalt quality? Or is it something which maybe is higher developed in humans than in other species? So, the origins of the Gestalt notion in psychology go back to before the First World War. But it mainly flourished in Germany in the interwar years. Gestalt psychology represented a break with atomism and sensation-based psychology. Sensation-based psychology goes back to the very earliest days of psychology, with the work of Helmholtz, who was actually a physiologist. And the idea of atomist psychology was that sensation is made up, that perception is made up of lots and lots of sensations which are somehow discriminated and added together associatively to make perceptions. So, for the early psychology of the atomists, it was the sensation which was the basic unit of the study of perception. The Gestaltists challenged this notion, but they also rejected the behaviorist notion of stimulus in favor of a focus on whole real objects in relation to the activity of a whole organism. Remember, for the behaviorist, the stimulus must be able to be isolated and measured. No, said the Gestaltists, this is not the point. The important thing is not the measurability, the quantitative notion of the stimulus, but rather its qualitative wholeness and its dynamism. So Gestalt psychology, in a very significant way, prefigured the ecological theory of perception of James Gibson, and it was related to another notion, the notion of Umwelt, which was developed by an animal behavior theorist called von Oixkreuz. I'll say a little word about Gibson. For Gibson was a psychologist of perception working after the Gestaltists. His interest was in dynamic perception, and he was interested in real-world perception. As a matter of fact, he did much of his applied research in the Second World War, and his interest was in how pilots land planes, given a pattern of lights around runways, and how, given a pattern of lights at night, a pilot can safely land a plane. And he said, no, it's no good looking at these, this kind of perception in the way in which we usually do that in a laboratory, which is by sitting the subject down and making them stay still and looking at a static scene and trying to look at visual illusions and that kind of thing. No, we have to look at the dynamics of the thing. And he developed from this the theory of what he called direct perception. That is to say, he said, it's not the case that we pick up the sensations and then we process them using some computational mechanism, and out of that comes the object. No, he said, we directly perceive objects. Objects are meaningful. And that was the basis of ecological psychology. And the whole meaning of ecological is to emphasize the strength of this bond between organism and environment, the way in which organismic activity is adapted to a real environment. And this interrelationship is one of mutuality. And so the Gestaltists, I guess, were also influenced by this idea of the Umwelt, which was basically simply the notion that for every organism, there is a particular environment within which it exists and which is significant for it. And even the most humble animal, even one-celled organisms, nematodes and multi-celled but extremely simple organisms have an environment to which they respond. So a one-celled organism, for example, responds to nutrient gradients in the water around it, swimming up towards more concentrated nutrient gradients. And for every organism, their environment is restricted by their perceptual apparatus, which selects out what is relevant for its own survival. And Gestalt psychology kind of builds on this notion by suggesting that, in fact, it's these whole objects, and indeed entire complex patternings, which are meaningful, which our perceptual apparatus is seeking out in our Umwelt, or environment, or ecological niche. The Gestalt psychologist Wolfgang Köhler was the first researcher to study non-human primates using film. He claimed from his observations that chimpanzees are capable of what he called insight learning. He did sort of experiments where he would put objects in the cage of a chimpanzee, of the ape, and he would wait to see the way in which the ape would put together the objects which were made available in such a way that they could use these objects in order to attain a goal. So, for example, he would see whether the chimpanzee was able to put two sticks together in order to reach a banana which was out of reach using just one stick. And doing a number of these kinds of experiments, he found that they were able to do this. So what they were able to do was they were able to take diverse objects to hand and mentally construct a pattern which would be a new object. And they did not do this using trial and error. You can't like use one stick to try and get the banana and then another stick to try and get the banana and through trial and error put the two sticks together. No. You actually have to sort of have the insight, put the two sticks together, make a bigger stick. And he said, yes, they are able to do that. So, Köhler's claim, I guess, was that at least some of the kind of qualities which characterize human cognition and perception, namely its Gestalt quality, at least some of this is available to other species as well. Interestingly, Gestalt psychology was also influential in modern art movements. Can you all see what that is? Can anybody see anything in this abstract picture? Man on a horse. How many people saw that before I said it? How many people had to hear me say it before they saw it? Oh. Did everybody see it? Well, anyway, yeah, it's a man on a horse. So the kind of painting that this artist, who's a Dutch artist called Van der Leck, the kind of painting that he did, what he was trying to do was show how by using patterned elements you could actually get a representation out of it. You could do representational paintings which look like abstract paintings, but they are in fact put together in such a way that the Gestalt quality kind of comes out to the perceiver. Okay, some more pictures. I will, well, in a minute. So, I'm going to ask a question about the previous slide. This one, yeah? Does that slide suggest that representation, what we call representation, has more to do with the recognition of a representational intent than with fidelity to the original? Now that's important. Think about this in the context of the debates that went on in modern art about what representation really is. Because for the traditionalists, they said, for something to represent something, it has to really resemble it very closely. But then other people were saying, no, the important thing is, if I say it's a representation, it's a representation. And this example suggests actually the representational intent has got to do more with the representational status has got to do more with the intentionality than with fidelity. But, on the other hand, you can't get rid of fidelity altogether, because the Gestalt has got to somehow or another bring to mind what is represented. So recognition of this representational intent must also involve the recognition of what is intended to be represented. Now, I introduced that consideration because I'm going to explore it further tomorrow, where I look at the notion of representation, which is central to contemporary cognitive science, in more detail and critically. Gestalt notions have also been very important in thinking about visual ambiguity and visual illusion. I want to ask a question. How many of you have seen this picture before? Can you put your hands right up? Yeah. So all of you who have seen this before, keep quiet. Okay. The others of you who have not seen this before, how many of you can see a young woman? How many of you can see an old woman? Can anybody see both the young woman and the old woman? Okay, so look, this is a figure in which when you see the young woman is looking away. She's looking over there, and this is the top of her cheekbone and the hollow of her eye there, and you can see an eyelash there. She's looking over there. That's her hair, and here is the line of her jaw, okay? And here is her delicate little ear, and here is a necklace, okay? So that's the young woman. The old woman, this again is her hair, but this here is her nose, and there's her eye, and here's her mouth, and this is her chin. Yeah? So can all of you now see both of them? If you can't see them both together, but you can sort of switch. So the point here is that exactly the same visual information can be fitted together into two different patterns or gestalts, yeah? In the language of psychology, you could say that the same stimulus has got two different stimulus interpretations. In a more everyday language, and one which is closer to linguistics, we could say that the same visual information can have two different meanings. It's ambiguous. The line drawing that you've just seen is often referred to as the old woman, young woman illusion. But it is not really an illusion. Rather, it's a puzzle, and it's a puzzle of construal, to use the term that Lanaka uses in cognitive grammar. Once the observer construes the image a certain way, this construal determines the significance of each of the elements. And that is the essence of the Gestalt phenomenon. And that's why Lanaka's notion of construal in cognitive linguistics is intimately connected with Gestalt. Here's another notion, which is often used in cognitive linguistics: figure and ground. These terms were introduced into psychology by a Danish psychologist called Edgar Rubin in 1914. And this is a very abstract representation of the notion that when we perceive a visual scene, we perceive always a figure against the ground. Here's a very common puzzle, if you like, which is based on the figure-ground phenomenon. I guess almost everybody has seen this one before, yeah? Depending on which is the figure and which is the ground, you either see a vase against a black vase, the figure, against a white background, the ground, or you see two faces, white figure against a black ground. Yeah? So reverse the figure and reverse the ground, you get, or reverse the figure-ground relationship, you get two different construals. Lanaka transforms this into the notion of trajector and landmark, where we say, for example, if the trajector is a moving object, okay, and that's the path of motion, and it's going over some kind of landmark or ground, we say, for example, I don't know, the ball is going or flying over, I don't know, the house, something like that. Yeah, this is a very schematic drawing. Or the plane is flying over the house. But we could also reverse the figure-ground orientation and say the house is under the plane or the path of the plane. We'll look at these issues in more depth when we talk about spatial semantics. But the point is, figure-ground relationship and our ability to flip between alternative figure-ground construals also gives us flexible linguistic construal of spatial relations. So in this case, we could say, we could look at this particular configuration, and we could say either the star is above the cross, in which the star is the figure, and the cross is the ground, or we can say the cross is below the star, where the cross is the figure and the star is the ground. Gestalt has been extremely influential in cognitive linguistics. For Gestalt psychologists, experience was not merely the registration of sensations and the attempt to tie them together through association. Experience was considered to involve the active contribution of the subject and his or her point of view. Cognitive linguists such as Lakoff, Lanaka, and Talmy have built on these notions in emphasizing that speakers are also embodied experiencers and active cognizers. But are some forms of flexible construal only available to language users? That's a question that I'll probably leave for later, but it is possible that the possession of natural language enables us to construct new kinds of construals which are not available to creatures that do not have language. Perhaps language is a key part of the human Umwelt, because it not only reflects cognition and perception, but also transforms them through what I this morning called semiotic mediation. The next concept that we shall look at is schema. Remember, again from this morning's lecture, that classical cognitivism inherited from formalist linguistics the idea that rules operate over internal symbols, sometimes called the physical symbol system. In place of rules, cognitive functional linguistics employs the concept of schema. A schema is a principle of organization, applying to and unifying perception and cognition, or conceptualization, as we call it in cognitive linguistics. The term conceptualization is central. The notion of schema goes back to some arguments by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant from as far back as 1781, would you believe it? Kant observed that since antiquity, it had been generally agreed that concepts are related to abstract images or mental pictures. Certainly in the work of Greek philosophers like Aristotle, he thought that that words were signs of images, and images were copies of objects in the mind. But, says Kant, any single member of a category or any single image will always be too particular to cover all cases. Even an ideal image, a Platonic image, will be too concrete. So you could say, for example, that the ideal or Platonic triangle is an equilateral triangle, that is a triangle with 3 equal sides. But an equilateral triangle cannot represent all triangles because many triangles have got unequal sides. So you can see the relationship between this and Gestalt theory as well, in a way. Because the point being that if you think about the image as a representation, a specific image can't cover all the particularities of the entire class or category which we are trying to represent. So, this is what Kant said. Indeed, he said, it is schemas, not images of objects, which underlie our pure sensible concepts. Now, as I read this, I should tell you that this is from a translation which is from the 1920s, so the English is a bit old-fashioned as well. But I think it's still the main translation available. But anyway, we'll go through it. It is schemas, not images of objects, which underlie our pure sensible concepts. What he means by our, that is something like our perceptual categories. The concept dog signifies a rule, he says, a rule, according to which my imagination can delineate the figure of a 4-footed animal in a general manner, without limitation to any single determinate figure, such as experience or any possible image that I can represent in concreto, concretely, actually presents. Well, it's a rather long-winded way of saying, look, instead of images, we need schemas, which are like rules, which pull all these different individual instances together into something which looks like in some way a concept, or at least a category. And then he says, whereas all intuitions, by which I think he means perceptions, rest on affections, by which I think he means sensations. Concepts, he says, rest on functions. And then he has a think and he says, by function, I mean the unity of the act of bringing various representations together under one common representation. And that's the schema, which is like a rule. It's like a rule because it's functionally equivalent to a rule. The schema is like a rule functionally, but it's not a rule because it's not determinate. A rule of the kind that you find in, for example, a transformational grammar has got to take, it's an algorithm which has got to take, a determinate formula on the left-hand side and yield a determinate formula on the right-hand side. But schemas are not so determinate as that. But Kant thought that the concepts of language what he called discursive concepts, are determinate in at least one sense, that they have stability of meaning. Or at least we can use them in a determinate way. So Kant, interestingly, and think about this when you think about cognitive linguistics, and particularly when you think about George Lakoff's theory of meaning, Kant did not say that schema and concept are the same. He actually thought that schemas bridge perception and conception. Schemas are the mental, functional processes, if you like, which enable us to unify perception in such a way that we can actually develop concepts out of perception. How does the schema work? Well, obviously schemas are stored representations in memory. The question then is, how do they abstract from specific objects or episodes, and yet be flexible enough to accommodate new instances of the category to which they apply? Because the schema has to be able to accommodate novelty. Kant did not know the answer to this, but he did actually think that in the end, science would provide an answer. As it happens, the answer was provided in the 1980s by a computational theory called parallel distributed processing, or connectionism. This is what Rumelhart, McClelland, and the PDP research group wrote in their book in 1986. They used, for the plural of the word schema, they used the term schemata, which is a sort of Latin way of doing it. I will just say schemas because I can't be bothered to fiddle around between Latin and English. But they use the term schemata, and Piaget also used the word schema all the time. And he also said schemata, and oh dear. Anyway, this is what they say. On the one hand, schemata are the structure of the mind. On the other hand, schemata must be sufficiently malleable, that means flexible, to fit around most anything. There is no representational object that is a schema. Sorry, that's a misspelling. There is no representational object that is a schema. Rather, schemata emerge at the moment they are needed from the interaction of large numbers of much smaller elements working in concert with one another. And that's the essence of parallel distributed processing, about which I'm not really going to say anything much more. But I think it's very significant that at the same time that cognitive linguists were coming up with their theories of image schemata, that computer scientists and computational psychologists like Rumelhart and McClelland were coming up with ways of modeling human perception and the human cognitive system, which showed how it could be done. And in fact, right the way from then onwards, there has been this enormous debate in cognitive science about whether you can actually get as far as concepts from parallel distributed processing, with the classical cognitivists saying, oh, well, that's all very well for perception, but it's not good enough for concepts. Now, and I, of course, think that you can get from there to concepts, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. So, connectionist neural networks implement schemas and also give rise, as an effect of the way that they work, they give rise to prototype effects in perception. And this is actually a natural consequence of the computational mechanism itself. And all of you, I guess, have read in the work of Lakoff and others about prototype effects and not just Lakoff, by the way, but John, I've forgotten his name. But anyway, you've all read about prototype effects. And it is important to point out that prototype effects are not just experimentally proven through perception research with human beings. They are also inevitable byproducts, almost, you might say, of the way that neural networks work. Prototype effects are a consequence of the way that your brain works, if we assume that connectionist artificial neural networks are a good model of the way that the actual real brain works. Schemas in cognitive linguistics. Here are some uses of the term schema. First of all, we have the well-known notion of the image schema. For example, this image schema for over, as discussed by Lakoff and Brugman. Image schemas, Lakoff continually emphasizes, are preconceptual. Idealized cognitive models. For example, the idealized cognitive model for the term, for the word bachelor, discussed by Lakoff following Fillmore, which is based upon also upon Fillmore's frame semantics. And the interesting thing about idealized cognitive models is that I think if you look at Lakoff's discussion of this, these are no longer preconceptual, they are actually meant to be conceptual models. Event schemas. For example, the schema agent, action, object. Construction schemas. For example, the dual object schema discussed by Adele Goldberg. So the notion of schema has got very wide application in cognitive linguistics, all the way from preconceptual through conceptual to linguistic organization. Related notions to schemas are scripts and frames. Shank and Abelson in 1977 published a book called Scripts, Plans, Goals and Understanding. And their question was how to computationally represent conventional sequences of action. And a famous example that they use, which Lakoff uses quite a lot in his presentations, but he never references Shank and Abelson, is the restaurant script. And the restaurant script says basically, how do things go and in what order when you walk into a restaurant? You know, first of all, you go in, you find a table, you sit down, you know, what order the courses come in, and then you ask for the bill, you pay the bill, etc. And of course, an important issue here, it may be rather trivial in relationship to the restaurant script, but it may not be trivial in other contexts, is that there is a great deal of cultural variation, or some degree of cultural variation, in the way in which these scripts operate in different cultures. So schemata can exist at different levels of organization. That is to say, all the way down from image schemas or schemas for perception, right the way up to more higher level cognitive schemas like the restaurant script. Also, frames and scripts. A frame is really basically a very big schema with lots of different sub-schemas in it, yeah? Frames and scripts can be partitioned or segmented. In other words, they're not indivisible. But they can be complex constituent structures. So how has this notion been applied in various areas of cognitive science? Well, it's been looked at in language, cognitive, and cultural development. For example, children learn early words by embedding their use in repetitively occurring events that can be schematically represented. This is the work of Catherine Nelson, who looked at how children, for example, acquire the meaning of the word ball from contexts of interaction where somebody throws a ball or bounces a ball. Michael Tomasello has shown how children learn grammar by partitioning the slots of construction frames and recombining words and expressions. Narratives are important higher order frames for understanding self, other, and world, and have been explored by Nelson and by Bruner. Because obviously narratives have got a frame structure which involves various participants, a protagonist, an antagonist, obstacles to be overcome, goals to be attained, and this kind of thing. And people tend to structure the way that they think about their own self in narrative terms. Now let's get back and examine again this notion of the similarities and differences between the idea of the schema and the idea of the rule. As I said, a schema is like a rule, but because a schema can be preconceptual, not just conceptual, doesn't have to be conceptual, can be preconceptual, in those cases, it's not a rule in the strict sense. Because a rule in the strict sense has got to be conceptual. It's got to be explicit. For example, parallel distributed processing models contain no rules. The only rules are those imposed by the observer. I'm sorry this one's come out a bit small. Can you read it? But schemas can also be conceptual. And when they are conceptual schemas, they can be the object as well as the means of cognition. So let's take as an example kinship systems. A kinship system can be thought of as a schema with various relationships between family members as nodes in, say, a network of kinship, or slots in an intergenerational frame. And we use those for thinking about relationships, but we can also reflect upon them. We can take that schema as an object of knowledge, and we can try and describe it. The schemas of language, which govern the assembly of constructions, as in construction grammar, are conventionally organized. So in that sense, language does have rules, but they are not autonomous rules, and they are not, as it were, internal. They are the rules which govern the way that language is used. A schema can be private. So, for example, if we want to understand the schema's underlying perception, object perception, for example, this certainly is something which can exist purely at the individual level. But a rule cannot. And that's something that we talked about this morning when we discussed very briefly Wittgenstein's notion of, or Wittgenstein's objections against the idea of a private language, and Itkonen's expansion of this. So rules are normative by definition, and schemata can also be normative as well. For example, a kinship system is normative. It does say what should be and what shouldn't be. For example, anthropologists know that in some kinship systems it is not permitted for first cousins to marry. And in other kinship systems in other cultures, it is permitted for first cousins to marry. Let's look briefly at cultural and linguistic schemas. Schemas may be culturally specific. Some examples. Politeness scripts. Here's a fairly typical one, which we all know the pitfalls which lurk in the way of the unwary traveller, going from one culture to another, not knowing quite what is polite behaviour in this culture and whether it corresponds to polite behaviour in their own culture. Kinship frames can also be culturally variable, and schemas for cultural spaces and times. What to do at what time, where to be, those kinds of things. Who's allowed to be in this space? Who's supposed to be in this space? All of those kinds of schemas can vary between cultures. And in such cases, we speak of cultural schemas or cultural models. Cultural models are intersubjectively shared by members of a cultural community, and they differ from the cultural schemas of other communities. And what we know from the work of cultural linguists, such as, for example, Gary Palmer, who I quoted this morning, is that cultural models may motivate grammatical facts in a language. For example, classifier systems, spatial frames of reference, and something that I shall talk about in another lecture later on in this series, notions of time and the linguistic expression of time exist. I think they exist at all these levels, as a matter of fact. I think the schema is a notion or a construct that binds together cognitive processes at all these levels, enabling the integration of individual with social cognition, which after all is one of the most fundamental issues in cognitive science. How do we put together all these individuals and get out of it a community? And I don't mean just a community of bodies, but a community of minds as well. Schemas help us understand how this could be. Lower level schemas are preconceptual and pre-linguistic. Some examples are schemas for containment, the support, or schemas for object categories. High-level schemas, organizing abstract domains like time, for example, clocks and calendars, are linguistically organized, conceptual, socially shared, and normative. They're schemas which depend upon semiotic mediation. They're not pre-linguistic. And this semiotic mediation extends actually beyond language itself into human artifacts. For example, here is a picture of a medieval clock from the city of Lund in Sweden, in the cathedral there. It's a very complicated artifact. At the top, it's got a clock face with 24 hours of the day. Down here, it's got the zodiac characters, not the Chinese zodiac, but the whatever Arabic zodiac, I suppose, or European, I don't know. And here it's got some little figures, mechanical figures, which come out, and music is played on the hour, and so on. But these cyclical faces around which hands move are actually representations of schemas. They're not just representations, they are embodiments of schemas. in that artifact. And so that clock is an instance of the extended embodiment of schemas. An extended embodiment was what I was, one of the key concepts that I was introducing this morning. Well, that brings us towards the conclusion of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is schemas and the materiality of representation. Schemas are where, there's a word missing there, schemas are where the cultural and the individual meet and interface. Because they can be embodied in artifacts, they are also where the representation of the mind in language and symbolization achieves material structure, not just in the brain, but in the world through extended embodiment. Thank you.